A quiet evening, an unexpected knock, and a conversation I never saw coming. What began as simple advice turned into a moment that changed how I see family, trust, and myself. Stay with me, because this story unfolds in ways you might recognize from your own life. Before we begin, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I love knowing where these stories are reaching. And if this kind of thoughtful, real-life storytelling speaks to you, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. It truly helps more than you know. I remember the sound of the clock in our hallway more clearly than anything else that evening. It was one of those steady, patient ticks that fills a quiet house and reminds you how much time has passed. My husband was away on a short business trip, the kind we'd grown used to over the years, and I was settling into my usual routine. A cup of tea, a book I'd already read twice, and the soft glow of a lamp in our bedroom. I was somewhere between reading and thinking about nothing at all when there was a gentle knock on the door. At first, I thought I imagined it. We live in a quiet neighborhood, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Then the knock came again, polite and hesitant. I wrapped my cardigan a little tighter and walked down the hall. When I opened the door, I saw my husband's nephew standing there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He's a grown-in, well into adulthood, with a calm face that always seemed older than his years. Still, there was something different about him that night. His eyes carried a heaviness I hadn't noticed before. "Auntie," he said softly, using the name he'd always called me. "I'm sorry to bother you. I was wondering if I could talk to you for a bit." I stepped aside without thinking. Family is family, and besides, he looked like someone who'd been holding something in for too long. He followed me down the hallway, glancing at the framed photos on the wall, the same ones he'd seen dozens of times during holidays and visits. When we reached the bedroom, I gestured toward the chair by the window. The room was warm, familiar, filled with the faint scent of lavender from the drawer sachets I insisted on using. He sat down carefully, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. I took my place on the edge of the bed, leaving a respectful distance between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clock ticked on, steady and patient. "I don't really know how to start," he said finally. His voice was low, thoughtful. "You've always seemed like someone who understands things. Life, I mean." I smiled gently, though I wasn't sure I deserved that description. "I've just lived a little longer," I said. "That gives you perspective, not all the answers." He nodded, taking that in. Then the words began to come. He talked about his work, the pressure he felt to have everything figured out by a certain age. He talked about relationships that hadn't turned out the way he hoped, about the fear of disappointing people he cared about. I listened, really listened, the way I'd wished someone had listened to me years ago when I was finding my own way. As he spoke, I became more aware of the room around us. The muted hum of a car passing outside, the way the lamplight softened the edges of everything it touched. There was a subtle tension in the air, not of anything improper, but of honesty. When someone finally decides to speak their truth, it changes the space between two people. I shared pieces of my own story, carefully chosen moments from my past. I told him about mistakes I'd made, about paths I thought were set in stone that turned out to be anything but. I spoke about patience, about the importance of being kind to yourself when the world seems demanding. He looked up at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me not just as his uncle's wife, but as a person with her own journey. "Thank you," he said after a while. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear this. There was a pause, comfortable and meaningful. I could feel a shift inside myself too, a reminder that even at this stage of life, we continue to discover new roles we can play for others. As he stood to leave, the heaviness in his eyes had eased, replaced by something steadier. After he left, I sat back down on the bed, listening once more to the clock. The house felt different, fuller somehow. I realized that night had given me something unexpected as well, a sense of purpose and a quiet affirmation that connection and understanding don't fade with time. They deepen if we let them. The next morning, the house felt different, as if the walls themselves remembered the conversation from the night before. Sunlight slipped through the curtains in thin lines, resting on the dresser and the familiar stack of books by the bed. I moved slowly, carrying my coffee from the kitchen back to the bedroom, still thinking about my husband's nephew and the quiet relief I'd seen in his face when he left. I told myself that was the end of it, a simple talk. Family helping family. Yet, as the day unfolded, I noticed how often my thoughts drifted back to that moment. Not because of anything inappropriate or dramatic, but because it reminded me of a part of myself I hadn't visited in a long time. The part that listens, that reflects, that feels useful beyond routines and responsibilities. In the early afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from him. It was brief and polite. He thanked me again and said our talk had stayed with him through the night. I read it twice, then set the phone down, unsure whether to respond immediately or let the moment rest. Eventually, I wrote back something simple, telling him I was glad our conversation helped and that he was always welcome to talk if he needed guidance. A few days passed before I saw him again. My husband was still away, and I was tending to small household tasks when I heard a familiar car pull into the driveway. This time there was no knock filled with hesitation. He entered with a cautious smile, holding a small bag of groceries. "I was nearby," he said, lifting the bag slightly. "Thought I'd check in and see if you needed anything." I appreciated the gesture more than I expected. We sat at the kitchen table, the afternoon light casting soft shadows across the wood. He spoke more easily now, less guarded. There was still seriousness in his words, but also curiosity. He asked about my early years of marriage, about how I navigated uncertainty without knowing how things would turn out. I answered honestly, without pretending I'd always been confident or wise. I told him about moments of doubt, about choosing patience when impatience would have been easier. As I spoke, I noticed how carefully he listened, as if each word mattered. It made me slow down, choose my thoughts with care. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I wish someone had told me earlier that it's okay not to have everything settled." I smiled at that. "Most of us learn that later than we'd like," I said. "Life has a way of teaching on its own schedule." The conversation drifted, touching on books we'd read, places we'd traveled, memories of family gatherings filled with noise and laughter. The tension from our first talk had softened into something steady and respectful. There was no rush, no expectation, just two people sharing time and perspective. When he left that afternoon, I felt a quiet sense of balance. I realized that offering advice wasn't about fixing someone's problems. It was about standing beside them while they found their own footing. That evening, as I prepared dinner for one, I felt more present than I had in weeks. Later that night, as I sat once again in the bedroom with the lamp glowing softly, I thought about how roles change as we age. We become listeners, guides, witnesses to others finding their way. And sometimes in doing so, we rediscover ourselves. The clock ticked on, marking time, but I no longer felt its weight. Instead, I felt ready for whatever conversations might come next. By the time my husband returned home, the rhythm of the house had shifted again. Suitcases came and went, stories from his trip filled the dinner table, and life resumed its familiar shape. Still, beneath the ordinary moments, I carried a quiet awareness that something within me had opened. I found myself paying closer attention to conversations, to pauses, to the things people didn't say out loud. My husband's nephew didn't visit as often after that, but when he did, there was an ease between us that hadn't been there before. Not familiarity in the wrong sense, but trust. The kind that grows when two people have spoken honestly without an audience. One evening, weeks later, he joined us for dinner. The three of us sat around the table, laughing about family stories, the clink of glasses and plates filling the air. From the outside, it was just another family meal. Yet I noticed small things. How he seemed more grounded, how his shoulders no longer carried that same weight. At one point, our eyes met across the table, and he gave me a brief nod. It was subtle, but I understood it as thanks. I returned the gesture with a gentle smile, nothing more. After dinner, my husband stepped out to take a phone call. The house grew quiet again, and my nephew lingered in the living room, studying a photograph on the shelf. It was an old one, taken years ago, of my husband and me standing in front of our first home. "You both look so hopeful here," he said. "We were," I replied, "and scared. Those two feelings often arrive together." He turned toward me then, leaning lightly against the back of the couch. "Do you ever miss who you were back then?" The question caught me off guard. I thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," I said honestly, "but I also respect who I've become. Every version of me led to this one." He nodded slowly, as if storing the thought away for later. When my husband returned, the moment passed naturally, without awkwardness. Still, the question stayed with me long after everyone had gone to bed. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on my own life more deeply than usual. The routines I'd grown comfortable with, the quiet compromises, the strengths I'd built without realizing it. Talking with him had reminded me that growth doesn't stop just because the calendar pages keep turning. We continue to evolve, even when no one is watching. One afternoon, he called unexpectedly. His voice was steady but thoughtful. He told me he'd made a decision about his career, choosing a path that felt right instead of one that simply looked good on paper. He said our conversations had helped him see things more clearly. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "you made a difference." After we hung up, I sat in the silence of the living room, sunlight stretching across the floor. His words warmed me in a way that surprised me. Not pride exactly, but reassurance. A reminder that being present, being willing to listen, matters. That evening, as my husband and I took our usual walk around the neighborhood, I felt lighter. The trees swayed gently, and the air carried the scent of cut grass. I realized that this chapter of my life wasn't about fading into the background. It was about understanding my value in quieter, deeper ways. Sometimes, guidance flows in both directions. And sometimes, the most meaningful connections come not from dramatic moments, but from calm conversations that leave lasting marks. I sensed that whatever lay ahead, I was stepping into it with clearer eyes and a steadier heart. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons in our small town shifted quietly. The leaves changed from the bright greens of early summer to soft golds and oranges, and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter. Life continued its usual rhythms, my husband and I going about our days, friends stopping by for tea, errands running their familiar course. But beneath it all, something had shifted in the way I experienced family, connection, and myself. One afternoon, I heard a knock at the door that was neither hesitant nor hurried. I opened it to find my husband's nephew standing there, a gentle smile on his face and a small notebook tucked under his arm. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. There was a quiet confidence in his tone that hadn't been there before, the kind that comes from facing one's own uncertainty and finding footing. We moved to the living room and settled into the worn but comfortable chairs near the window. Sunlight spilled across the carpet, highlighting the little imperfections and memories embedded in our home. The frayed edges of the rug, the stack of magazines on the side table, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. He opened the notebook and handed it to me. "I've been keeping track of things," he said. "Thought maybe you could give me some advice again." We spent the next hour flipping through notes, ideas, and reflections he'd written down, plans for his work, thoughts on relationships, questions about choices he felt unsure of. As we talked, I realized that the conversations we'd shared over the past months had become something of a ritual, a gentle anchor for him and for me. I offered guidance when I could, and when I didn't have an answer, I listened. Sometimes just listening was the most important thing of all. As the afternoon light faded into evening, I noticed how much he had grown. not just in confidence, but in self-awareness. He asked questions thoughtfully, considered the answers carefully, and expressed gratitude in a way that felt genuine, unforced. I found myself reflecting on my own journey, realizing how much I had changed since the very first night he knocked on my door. I had learned patience, empathy, and the quiet power of presence. Eventually, he closed the notebook and smiled at me. "I feel like I can see things a little clearer now," he said. "Thank you for being here." I reached out and patted his hand, a gesture of reassurance and care. "You've done the work," I reminded him. "I just helped you notice it." After he left, I lingered in the living room, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the trees outside. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. I realized that the connection we'd formed wasn't about advice or guidance alone. It was about trust, respect, and the courage to be honest with ourselves and others. That night, as I prepared for bed, I thought about the journey that had started with a simple knock on my door. What had felt like a small moment had blossomed into something far more meaningful. A reminder that meaningful connections can appear unexpectedly, and that even in the later chapters of life, growth, understanding, and mutual respect remain possible. I fell asleep that night feeling a deep sense of peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've helped someone find their way, and in doing so, found a little more of your own. Life, I realized, keeps offering us these quiet, profound moments if we are willing to notice them. And sometimes the most unexpected conversations can leave the longest lasting marks.